Last year, I started working on a story about my clothes because I got a good deal on some stuff, and it made me wonder how that company was making any money. And assuming that company was going to take a profit, what did that mean for the people who actually sewed the clothes in my closet? I got an answer, and just as I was about to publish this story, the world changed because of COVID. The fashion industry took a major hit, and the beginnings of an online movement that was going to ask brands what they pay their lowest paid employee took a backseat to the pandemic.
The fashion industry is one of the biggest kind of culprits in labor.
That's because as little as 2% of the people who make clothes around the world earn a living wage. That's defined as enough money to pay for their basic needs. But what would it take to change that?
Here's the truth. The $10 t-shirt will probably have to go away.
Basically, we want brands to share their lowest wages. It's really that simple.
Inside the Nashville jewelry factory at fashion brand Able. An audit last year proved employees weren't being paid enough. The lowest paid employee was making more than Nashville's minimum wage, but that is less than the living wage. And if it's happening in Nashville, you know it's happening in other countries made famous by the tags inside our clothes. You say asking a fashion CEO what's your lowest wage is the most dangerous question you can ask them.
Yes, asking the question, what's your lowest wage, to a large fashion brand is the most dangerous question a CEO of a fashion brand can be asked, because it's so revealing about what's actually going on within their supply chains. The issue of wages has been going on for a long time, and getting people to a living wage where they can have their most basic needs met is critically important. But NGOs and governments and brands and factories have been kind of talking in circles about this for a long time, but we really wanted to find one data point that cuts through all the noise and makes it really simple, and that's the lowest wage, because the lowest wage is what actually protects the most vulnerable workers.
The idea is that if the person at the bottom's being paid enough, so is everyone else. So, two competitors, Nisolo and Able, formed the Lowest Wage Challenge, an invitation for brands everywhere to publish what they're paying employees at the bottom.
We wanted to put a very clear data point of a number in front of the consumer, which is the lowest wage at the manufacturer. Not an average wage, because that doesn't protect the people at the bottom, right? And not a labor cost per garment, because that's what goes to the factory. But what is the lowest wage? And that information protects the woman that is at the very bottom of that wage ladder.
Both companies thought they were doing it right, but when they actually audited their factories outside of the US, they found things they didn't like. Nisolo's factories in Kenya and Mexico were paying a living wage, but in Peru, they needed to pay a little bit more. Able has 4 Ethiopian factories. Pay at 2 needed to increase.
One of the manufacturers, we actually found incidents of slave labor. And to feel like we were a part of that was really discouraging. The truth is, as disheartening as it was heartening because that's exactly why we created the audit.
Now, both companies are making moves to pay every employee at those lagging factories enough to meet their basic needs. It made me wonder, if Able and Nisolo have figured it out, why doesn't everyone else?
When someone, especially a large corporation, says that they don't have that information or can't get it, that's just not true. They have all the leverage in the world to get that information and do something about it. But part of it is that what you pointed out earlier is a lot of their product sales are based on paper-thin margins. When you're selling a $9 t-shirt, there's not a lot of room to make sure that someone that made it is taken care of.
So as I'm learning about this problem, I'm realizing that I am contributing to it. I'm learning about the different brands and what they pay people. I'm realizing that the clothes I even wore to this interview are made by brands that are some of the worst offenders in this problem. And in fact, these clothes, the people that made them were probably paid way, way below what's considered a living wage. And I have to think about that more as I go forward, the things I'm buying, how often I'm wearing them. And it's something about knowing that that problem exists and that the stuff on your body could be contributing to it that actually creates your willingness to change.
I think the assumption is that the greatest perpetrators are those brands that have really cheap products. That's not the reality of it. I've met with companies before that have $2,000 handbags. And the assumption is, well, oh gosh, certainly a $2,000 handbag equals more in the back pocket of the worker. And that is, I've found, rarely true. The only thing that you need to know, and that's why we came up with that data point, is what is the lowest wage of the person making that product. That is the only way to truly know if someone is being paid fairly.
At Nisolo, a shoemaker named Willen helped Woodyard understand the impact when we buy clothes made by an underpaid worker.
El maltrato al trabajador, muchas veces no pagarle un salario justo, pero a pesar de ello, nuestro corazón siempre agradecido a Dios, ¿no? Agradecido a Dios, a la oportunidad que se nos abrió.
These are real people with actual names and families that I can pick up my phone and FaceTime with right now, or I can be sitting on their living room tomorrow. We need to start recognizing that these are actual people that are being affected by this reality. What I learned was that his history was basically one of a ton of abuse in the footwear industry, to the point where he actually quit and decided to try to start his own thing, and wasn't able to meet the needs of his family, but it was because of how poorly he was treated in every other circumstance he'd been in. He's still with us today, 8 years later, and is a supervisor on our line.
Podemos formar una empresa digna, que dignifique al trabajador, que abrace verdaderamente tanto el lado humano como el lado económico, ¿no? Y juntos podamos seguir creciendo así como lo está haciendo Nisolo en nuestro sector aquí en Perú.
One thing that people really have wrong is that they think, oh, we have to pay so much more money to provide a living wage, but most research says that it would only change the cost of a product for a brand by 1% to 4%. That's all it would take.
Of course, the problem is that if companies don't publish what they pay, you have no idea if you're helping the problem or adding to it. Is it possible to dress yourself with clothes where the people that made them were treated well?
Yeah, it's really hard to. It will take a lot of effort.
So, Ward wants to introduce a fashion nutrition label of sorts. You can know the backstory of what you're buying, and if you don't like it, leave it on the shelf. He plans to have labels on his products by next year.
If that tag is on every single product in a store like this, and you've got multiple brands you're shopping from, doesn't that have to become a data point that you choose based on?
Consumers are demanding this, and if you're not swimming in this lane in a serious way, then you're going to get left. What's happening is a lot of brands are talking that way, but they can't back it up, and at some point they're going to get found out.
So that was before the pandemic, but I wanted to chat with Patrick and Barrett to get an update on where things stand now. I mean, they were weeks away from announcing a coalition of brands that was committed to the challenge. Of course, all that got put on hold.
Almost all the brands we spoke with were kind of like, hey, obviously we need to focus on our own supply chain and our own initiatives this year. We're still very interested, but we got to get focused on making sure we make it through this thing. Just like every other brand, we've had to majorly decrease our expenses, to navigate this, which meant, both in the U.S. and across our supply chain, having to reduce the size of our staff. From a wages standpoint, from administration in Peru to our team here in the U.S., it did mean reducing wages, by approximately 20%, depending on the role, higher in some cases. But every one of those wages, was already way above a living wage, and post that decrease for this year and expense is still far above a living wage. What we don't mess with, and that we don't allow economic turmoil or any circumstances to change, is that everyone is paid a living wage.
Over at Able, 65% of U.S. employees were furloughed in the spring, but at year-end, 70% of those are back full-time. Some salaried staff took a 20% pay cut. Even with the cut, everyone was still paid above a living wage.
The best thing consumers can do is ask their favorite brands that question, on social media, on their latest post, through email if they don't want it to be public. Hey, what's the lowest wage in your supply chain, and how far is that from a living wage? Because the more times that question is asked, the more times that conversation's coming up in boardrooms where decisions are made.